Disclaimer: this presentation is for education and encouragement only, not medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Nothing here replaces a qualified healthcare provider who knows your history. Please consult your own doctor before starting, stopping, or changing any medication, supplement, or therapy. Presented from a Seventh-day Adventist perspective, offered with respect, with every research claim tied to a verifiable source.
A warning put in writing in 1905. Flesh was never the best food, but its use is now doubly objectionable since disease in animals is so rapidly increasing. Ellen G. White, The Ministry of Healing, 1905, page 313. She had no laboratory, no microscope, no way to measure a single nutrient, and yet the data wouldn't catch up to her for nearly a century. Hold on to that. We're going to test it. Welcome. Glad you're here. And I want to say we are genuinely glad you chose to spend this time with us. Before we get into anything, I want to take 2 minutes to tell you exactly what you've walked into, because I think that matters. This series was built for people who have a feeling, and maybe you know this feeling, that something isn't quite adding up with their health. Maybe you're tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. Maybe you've had labs come back normal and still don't feel normal. Maybe you're just curious about what's in your food and what it's actually doing for your body. Whatever brought you here, that instinct to ask questions and look for answers is exactly the right instinct. And this is a good place to follow it. Now, I want to be upfront about a few things. First, you don't need any kind of science background to be here. Every concept in this presentation is going to be explained in plain language, and every technical term gets a plain English translation. If you can have a conversation about food, you can follow along. I promise. Second, every single claim in this presentation comes from a real, verifiable source. Peer-reviewed research, biblical scholarship, historical records. You'll see the citations right on the slide where they appear. If something sounds surprising, please look it up. That's not a challenge, it's an invitation. We want you to verify this yourself. Third, and this is important, nothing you hear today is medical advice. We want to be completely clear about that. What we're trying to do is give you better information so you can have more productive conversations with your own healthcare provider. Not to replace that conversation, to improve it. And finally, there are no wrong questions here. If something doesn't make sense, ask. If you want us to slow down, say so. If you hear something you disagree with, bring it up. Honest dialogue is how good health education actually works. Take notes if you want to. Take breaks when you need to. Take the content at whatever pace works for you. All right, let's begin.
Welcome, everyone. Over the next 6 hours, spread across 3 sessions, we are going to connect 3 powerful stories that belong together. The first is the story of a 19th century woman who predicted, in writing, with remarkable specificity, that the food supply would become something we could no longer depend on. She wrote that in 1899. Science confirmed it 105 years later with peer-reviewed data from the USDA's own food composition database. The second story is what that food crisis is actually doing inside your body right now, at the cellular and molecular level, and why millions of people who feel chronically tired and chronically unwell, yet are told by their doctors that everything looks fine, are experiencing something that has a name, a mechanism, and a verifiable explanation. The third story is about who profits when that cycle continues, and why, despite spending $4.5 trillion per year on healthcare, the most common chronic diseases have not been solved in more than 70 years. Every single claim you will hear across all 3 parts comes with a verifiable peer-reviewed source or public government record. The slide notes contain every citation. You are not only encouraged, you are asked to look them up independently. Part 1 is built around a single, stunning fact. A woman who had no laboratory, no biochemistry degree, and no scientific training predicted, in writing, that rising disease and the corruption of the earth would make the food supply unsafe to depend on. She wrote it in 1899. Peer-reviewed science confirmed the collapse in food quality 105 years later. That gap between prophecy and proof is the story of Part 1.
Who was Ellen G. White? Ellen White was born in 1827 in Gorham, Maine. At age 9, she suffered a severe head injury that affected her health for the rest of her life. She had no university education. She was not a doctor, not a scientist, not a chemist. And yet, she wrote over 100,000 pages on health, nutrition, agriculture, education, and spirituality. She co-founded the Seventh-day Adventist Church. She inspired the founding of over 170 hospitals worldwide, and the institutions she built would go on to fund what became the Adventist Health Study, one of the longest and largest nutrition studies ever conducted on Earth. That study, funded by the National Cancer Institute and the National Institutes of Health, followed 96,000 participants. Its finding? People who follow the health principles White wrote about in the 1860s live measurably 4 to 10 years longer than average Americans, with significantly lower rates of heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. That is not a religious claim. That is a peer-reviewed finding published in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2013. The study was funded by the U.S. government. She wrote more than 40 books and 5,000-plus articles on health, starting at a time when germ theory was barely established and vitamins had not yet been discovered. The question this raises, how did she get it so right? Defining a prophet, a true prophet, and a false prophet. Before we go any further into Ellen White's story, we need to stop and get our definitions right, because a lot of confusion happens when people argue about whether someone was a real prophet without ever agreeing on what the word means. So let's do that work first. The word prophet in the Old Testament comes from the Hebrew word nabi, Strong's number H5030. It simply means one who is called to speak, specifically to speak God's message to the people. A prophet is an intermediary, a spokesperson. The primary job is not to predict the future, though that sometimes happens. The primary job is to deliver a message that wasn't their own idea. They didn't originate it, they transmitted it. That word nabi appears over 300 times in the Hebrew Bible. Deuteronomy 18:18 is the key passage. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites, and I will put my words in his mouth. Put my words in his mouth. That's the definition. Not their words, God's words. So how do you know if a prophetic claim is genuine? The Bible gives us 4 tests, and they're remarkably practical. Test 1 is accuracy. Deuteronomy 18:21 and 22. If a prophet speaks in God's name and it doesn't happen, that's not from God. This is a clean, falsifiable standard. One failed prophecy is enough to disqualify the claim. Not a maybe, not a, well, times changed. A failure is a failure. Test 2 is alignment with Scripture. Isaiah 8:20, one of the most direct verses in the Bible on this subject. To the law and to the testimony, if they speak not according to this word, there is no light in them. That's stark. If the teaching contradicts the existing revealed word of God, it fails here, regardless of any other credentials. Test 3 is fruit. Matthew 7:16 through 20. By their fruit you will recognize them. Not just the message, the life, the character, the long-term pattern. And 1 John 4 tells us to test the spirits, to not believe every spirit, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. Testing is not optional, it's commanded. Test 4 from Revelation 19:10. The testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. Every true prophetic voice ultimately points toward Jesus. This is the Christocentric test. Where is this voice pointing? Toward Christ or toward something or someone else? That brings us to the false prophet, and the Bible is not subtle here. Mark 1, presumption and failure. Deuteronomy 18:20 is direct. Speaking in God's name without being sent, or whose prophecies fail, is the definition of a false prophet. But it gets more nuanced in Deuteronomy 13, where Moses says that even if the sign or wonder comes true, if that prophet then tells you to follow other gods or reject Scripture, they're false. Accuracy alone is not sufficient. The content of the message matters. Mark 2 from Matthew 24:24. False prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. Signs and wonders are not proof. They can be counterfeited. The destination the prophet points you toward is what matters. Mark 3 is in Micah 3:11. Her prophets tell fortunes for money. And Jeremiah 23:16 and 17 describe false prophets as filling people with false hope, speaking visions from their own minds, not from the mouth of the Lord. They tell people what they want to hear. They validate sin. They don't call for repentance. Now here's why this matters for our next few hours. We're about to evaluate a woman who made specific written predictions, whose teachings can be compared against Scripture, whose life and character are historically documented, and whose advice is now measurable against 160 years of scientific data. Those 4 tests are our framework. We're not going to ask, did she seem like a nice person? We're going to ask what the evidence says against the standard the Bible itself gives us. America's food landscape when E.G.W. began writing. When Ellen White began writing about health in the 1860s, 74% of Americans lived on farms or in small towns. Food was grown locally and eaten close to harvest. Soil was farmed with rotation and organic matter, not because of any scientific understanding of soil biology, but because that was simply how farming had always been done. There were no synthetic fertilizers, no pesticides, no refrigerated interstate food transport system. Food was seasonal, local, and for most people, grown within miles of where it was consumed. And yet she was already warning about a corruption of the food supply that didn't yet exist on a large scale. The railroad expansion, early food adulteration scandals, and the emerging shift toward chemical and industrial farming were seeds already in the ground. Most observers of her era saw only progress. She saw where those seeds would lead. This is what makes her warnings remarkable. The threat she was describing had not yet materialized at scale. By the time she died in 1915, industrial agriculture was only beginning. The Green Revolution was still 28 years away, yet her warning was specific enough that when the crisis arrived, confirmed by the USDA's own data in 2004, it matched what she had written. The 1863 Health Vision, a Turning Point. On June 6, 1863, in Otsego, Michigan, Ellen White recorded what she called a comprehensive health vision. What she wrote next is worth pausing on. She recommended whole plant foods, grains, fruits, vegetables, and nuts as the primary diet. She recommended daily water intake. She recommended sunlight and fresh air. She recommended regular physical exercise. She recommended adequate sleep. And she recommended avoiding stimulants, including tobacco, alcohol, tea, and coffee. Here is the critical point. In 1863, science had not yet discovered vitamins. That discovery came in 1912, 49 years later. The gut microbiome had not been characterized. Antioxidants were not yet understood. The relationship between tobacco and cancer had not been established. Sleep deprivation's link to metabolic disease was completely unknown. Yet White's recommendations match almost exactly the current USDA Dietary Guidelines for Americans, 2020 to 2025, and the current WHO Global Action Plan on Physical Activity. She arrived at the same destination that 150 years of nutritional science would eventually reach, without a single laboratory. When the NIH-funded Adventist Health Study 2 confirmed in 2013 that people following these 1863 principles live 4 to 10 years longer than average Americans, that is peer-reviewed validation of an 1863 recommendation. The gap is 150 years. The convergence is exact.
In 1902, Ellen White wrote, "Tell them that the time will soon come when there will be no safety in using eggs, milk, cream, or butter, because disease in animals is increasing in proportion to the increase of wickedness among men." 3 years earlier, in 1899, she had already written, "Disease is accumulating rapidly. The curse of God is upon the earth, because man has cursed it. The habits and practices of men have brought the earth into such a condition that some other food than animal food must be substituted for the human family." 1863, her first comprehensive health vision with dietary recommendations that match modern science. 1899, she warns that disease is accumulating rapidly and that the corruption of the earth will force some other food than animal food to be substituted for the human family. 1915, she dies. Her predictions are on the documented record, with no scientific developments yet confirming them. 1943, the Green Revolution begins, 44 years after her warning, and food production fundamentally changes. 1960s, chemical farming explodes across America. Synthetic fertilizers and pesticides become standard. 2004, Davis, Epp, and Riordan publish in the Journal of the American College of Nutrition, confirming a 6 to 38% decline in key nutrients across 43 crops using the USDA's own food composition data. 44 years between the warning and the Green Revolution. 105 years between the warning and the peer-reviewed scientific confirmation. She did not say food will taste worse. She did not say food will become scarce. She said disease and corruption were entering the food chain at its source, so the food supply could no longer be safely depended on. The animal disease half of that warning is documented later in this section. The crop nutrient half is what Davis et al. Confirmed in 2004.
E.G. White's 8 Natural Remedies, remarkably ahead of her time. Ellen White identified what she called 8 natural remedies, written in Ministry of Healing, 1905, page 127. Let me walk through each one alongside the modern scientific validation. Pure food, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts, no refined foods. This matches current USDA dietary guidelines for Americans, 2020 to 2025, exactly. The guidelines were published 115 years after she wrote this. Water, 6 to 8 glasses daily, plus external water therapy. Confirmed by the Institute of Medicine's dietary reference intakes for water, 2004, as critical for all metabolic pathways. Sunlight, daily sun exposure for health, now confirmed as essential for vitamin D synthesis and circadian rhythm regulation. Holick M.F., 2007, New England Journal of Medicine, documented that vitamin D deficiency affects over 1 billion people globally. Exercise, daily physical activity for all ages. The WHO's 2020 Global Action Plan on Physical Activity confirms that 150 minutes per week reduces major chronic disease risk by 30 to 35%. Rest, regular sleep patterns plus the Sabbath principle. Sleep deprivation is now clinically linked to obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cognitive decline. Fresh air, ventilation, and outdoor breathing. WHO data shows indoor air pollution kills 3.2 million people per year, validating White's emphasis on fresh air and ventilation. temperance. Avoid excesses. No alcohol or tobacco. Alcohol is classified as an IARC Group 1 carcinogen. Tobacco causes 480,000 deaths per year in the U.S. alone. Trust in God. Mental and spiritual wellness. Mind-body medicine research confirms that stress reduction decreases cortisol and systemic inflammation, both measurable physiological outcomes. Ask yourself, how many of these 8 do you currently practice every day? Most people will honestly claim 3 or 4. The chronic disease crisis lives in that gap. Ellen White's Agricultural Warnings: Soil, Seeds, and Chemicals. White's warnings were not limited to what you put in your body. They extended to how the food was grown, connecting soil health directly to human health 60 years before soil science confirmed this relationship. Soil health as foundation. White emphasized maintaining rich, living soil as the foundation of food quality. In her 1902 Testimonies, Volume 7, page 82, she wrote that wisdom and care in the cultivation of land will accomplish much. Soil scientists would not formally document the relationship between soil health and crop nutrient density until the late 20th century. Montgomery, 2007 PNAS, confirmed that industrial farming loses topsoil 10 to 40 times faster than it forms. Local and seasonal eating. She advocated eating food grown close to home and in season, which modern post-harvest research has confirmed significantly affects nutrient content. Spinach loses up to 90% of its vitamin C within 24 hours at room temperature. Lee and Cater, 2000. Food grown far away and shipped for days or weeks cannot match the nutrient content of freshly harvested food. Chemical-free agriculture. White warned against artificial substances in farming, prefiguring Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, 1962, by decades. Carson's book documented the toxicological dangers of DDT and organochlorine pesticides. White had already warned about artificial substances in the food chain without knowing the specific chemistry. Crop diversity. She promoted growing a wide variety of crops, which modern agroecology has confirmed increases nutritional variety, soil resilience, and yields over time compared to monocultures. Ellen G. White on Plant-Based Eating, a Biblical and Scientific Foundation. White's case for plant-based eating rested on 3 foundations: biblical, practical, and compassionate. Biblical foundation. She grounded her recommendations in Genesis 1:29, God's original dietary instruction. In Daniel 1:12-15, Daniel's 10-day plant-based diet produced visibly better health than those eating the king's food, a documented biblical health experiment. 1 Corinthians 6:19 establishes the body as the temple of the Holy Spirit, requiring intentional care. Proverbs 12:10 connects righteous living to care for living things. Practical scientific validation. Modern science has since validated this position powerfully. A 30-year Harvard study of more than 200,000 people found that those with the highest plant-to-animal protein ratio had 19% lower cardiovascular disease risk. Satija et al., 2017, JACC. A meta-analysis of 49 studies confirmed lower rates of cancer, cardiovascular disease, and total mortality in plant-based eaters. Dinu et al., 2017, Critical Reviews in Food Science. The NIH-funded Adventist Health Study 2, with 96,000 participants, confirmed vegetarians live 4 to 10 years longer. Balance and nuance. Importantly, White was not originally a vegetarian. She made a progressive transition over time and explicitly warned against dietary fanaticism, against making diet a test of fellowship or a cause of social conflict. That balance is exactly what evidence-based behavioral science now recommends: gradual, sustainable dietary change, not rigid absolutism.
Understanding the term vegetarian, a spectrum, not one diet. Before we go further, let's get the word right, because vegetarian isn't one thing, it's a spectrum. At its core, a vegetarian leaves out meat, poultry, and fish. From there, it splits by what comes back in. A lacto-ovo vegetarian, the most common type, still eats dairy and eggs. A lacto-vegetarian keeps dairy but drops eggs. An ovo-vegetarian keeps eggs but drops dairy. A vegan removes all animal products. Then the edges. A pescatarian adds fish, and a flexitarian eats mostly plants with the occasional bit of meat, both technically semi-vegetarian. Why it matters. When a study or a friend says vegetarian, they could mean any of these, and the nutrition profile changes with each one. Who follows it? US data. Who are the vegetarians? So who actually eats this way? In the US, it's a small but stable slice. About 4% of adults call themselves vegetarian, roughly 1% vegan, and that's barely moved in over 20 years, even as plant-based products exploded on shelves. Globally, it's different. India is about 30% vegetarian, the world's highest. Within the US, some groups are likelier than others. Women, 6%, versus 2% of men. Younger adults far more than older, about 8% of under 35s versus 2% of those 55 plus, and around 14% of college students. People of color slightly more than white adults, and political liberals about 3 times conservatives. The reasons people give most are personal health and concern for animals or the environment. Socioeconomics, the money. Socioeconomics and the cost myth. Let's talk money and demographics, because there's a stubborn myth here. First, who? Against the wealthy hipster stereotype, lower-income Americans are actually more likely to be vegetarian. 7% under $40,000 versus 3% of upper-income earners. Education shows no clear pattern. Occupation? Honestly, the big surveys don't track it well, so I won't pretend there's a clean answer. Religion and culture, though, are major drivers. Now the myth. Most people assume plant-based is expensive. For whole foods, it's the opposite. A large Oxford study found vegetarian diets cost about 27 to 31% less than a typical Western diet, roughly $34 a week versus $50, about $900 a year saved. Vegan was cheaper still. The catch? That's whole foods. Beans, grains, vegetables, not processed meat substitutes, which can cost more. And yet 60% plus of Americans still believe plant-based costs more. The evidence, the benefits. The case for plant-based eating. Here's the upside, and it's substantial. The strongest data is the Adventist Health Study 2, over 73,000 people, the same study behind our earlier vegetarian slide. Vegetarians there had about 12% lower all-cause mortality overall, strongest in men. Heart disease mortality was notably lower, especially in pesco-vegetarians, a hazard ratio of 0.65. They also had lower type 2 diabetes, lower body weight, lower blood pressure, less metabolic syndrome, and in some analyses, lower cancer risk. And remember the cost slide? These patterns come with 2 bonuses that have nothing to do with the body. They cost less and have a smaller carbon footprint. So the case 4 points the same direction on health, wallet, and planet. The evidence, caveats. The honest caveats. Now the honest other half, because this is education, not advocacy. A vegetarian diet meets every nutritional need, but only when it's well planned, and the more restrictive it gets, the more these need attention. Vitamin B12 is the big one, essentially not available from plants, so vegans must supplement, not optional. Iron and zinc are in plants, but absorbed less efficiently. Omega-3s, the EPA and DHA kind, are hard to get without fish. Algae oil, flax, and walnuts help. Iodine matters if you're not using iodized salt, seafood, or dairy. on a fully vegan diet planned for calcium and vitamin D. Here's the tie back to the vegetarian mortality slide. That bump in neurological problems in the oldest vegetarians reads as a B12 and omega-3 deficiency signal, not evidence that plants are harmful. And that's the encouraging part. A deficiency you can see on a blood test is a deficiency you can fix. The Green Revolution, when EGW's prophecy began fulfilling. The Green Revolution began in 1943, confirmed by Encyclopedia Britannica, when the Rockefeller Foundation partnered with the Mexican government to launch a high-yield crop program led by Norman Borlaug. First, acknowledge what it achieved. The Green Revolution saved lives on a scale that is difficult to overstate. Norman Borlaug received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 and is credited by historians with preventing famine for over 1 billion people. That is a genuine, extraordinary humanitarian achievement, and it should be acknowledged without qualification. But acknowledge also what it cost. The crops were selected for one criterion above all others: maximum yield per acre. Bigger, faster-growing crops deliver more food per acre, but the nutrients per gram decline through what scientists call the dilution effect. The same mass of food contains fewer minerals and vitamins because the nutrients are spread across more cellular mass. Davis, 2009, Hort Science, documented this mechanism specifically. The key historical fact. White wrote her food supply warning in 1899, 44 years before this process began. That is the margin of prophetic accuracy we are documenting. The chemical agriculture explosion, 1940s to present. After World War II, the same industrial infrastructure used to make explosives was repurposed to make fertilizer. This is not a metaphor. It is documented chemical history. The Haber-Bosch process, developed to synthesize ammonium nitrate for bombs, became the foundation of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer used on most farms today. At the same time, nerve agent research conducted during the war produced the first organochlorine pesticides. DDT was introduced into agriculture in the 1940s. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, exposed the toxicological dangers of DDT and other pesticides, documenting how they accumulated in the food chain, harmed wildlife, and posed risks to human health. The U.S. banned DDT in 1972, but it remains detectable in human tissue globally today. Today, glyphosate, marketed as Roundup, is the world's most widely used herbicide. In 2015, the WHO's International Agency for Research on Cancer classified glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen, Group 2A. It is now detected in the urine of over 80% of Americans tested in a nationally representative sample using CDC NHA-NES data. Ospina et al., 2022, Environment International. Atrazine, introduced in 1958, remains the second most widely used herbicide in the U.S. and has been detected in groundwater in 36 states. It is classified as an endocrine disruptor, meaning it interferes with hormonal systems at very low concentrations. This chart represents the scientific confirmation of Ellen White's 1899 prophecy. Let me be precise about what the data shows. Davis, Epp, and Riordan in 2004, in the Journal of the American College of Nutrition, used the USDA's own food composition databases to compare nutrient levels in 43 garden crops between 1950 and 1999. This is a 49-year span. These are not measurements from an advocacy group. They are drawn from the official government database that nutritionists, doctors, and the USDA itself use. The results show statistically significant declines across 6 key nutrients. These are not measurement errors. They are consistent, reproducible findings, also replicated in UK food composition data by Mayer 1997, British Food Journal, an independent dataset reaching similar conclusions. More recently, Myers et al., 2014, Nature, documented that rising atmospheric CO2 is an additional and ongoing mechanism reducing zinc, iron, and protein in major crops by 3 to 17%. This means the problem identified in 2004 has continued to worsen and is projected to accelerate. The headline for the audience to take away? The food on your plate today is measurably less nutritious than the same food was in 1950. Not because of how you cook it, not because of your choices, because of how it was grown. Prophecy versus reality, a remarkable convergence. Row 1. White wrote in 1899 that disease is accumulating rapidly. The curse of God is upon the earth because man has cursed it, and that the earth's corruption would force some other food than animal food to be substituted. Davis. Confirmed 6 to 38% nutrient decline across 43 crops using USDA data. Myers added that rising CO2 reduces zinc, iron, and protein by an additional 3 to 17%. The prophecy is now a measured scientific fact. Checkmark confirmed. Row 2. White's agricultural writings warned against artificial substances and chemicals in farming. The USDA's pesticide data program has found pesticide residues on 70% plus of produce samples. Over 80,000 synthetic chemicals have been introduced into agriculture and the food supply since 1940. Checkmark confirmed. Row 3. White wrote repeatedly that the soil must be treated well, that soil was the foundation of food quality and human health. Montgomery confirmed that industrial farming loses topsoil 10 to 40 times faster than it naturally forms. USDA soil data confirms mineral depletion. Checkmark confirmed. Row 4. White recommended simple, natural foods close to how they were created, and warned against processing. Hall conducted a gold standard randomized controlled trial, the highest level of scientific evidence, and found that participants on ultra-processed diets ate 508 more calories per day and gained weight compared to whole food groups with identical food availability. Checkmark confirmed. Ask yourself, is this remarkable enough to change how you shop this week? Ellen G. White versus other 19th century health reformers. What made her different? White was not working in isolation. The 19th century produced a notable health reform movement that included several significant figures, and it is important for credibility to acknowledge this context rather than present White as a solitary genius. Sylvester Graham, 1794 to 1851, promoted vegetarianism and whole wheat bread. He had genuine insights but no institutional follow-through, and his approach was diet only, without spiritual integration. William Alcott, 1798 to 1859, founded the American Physiological Society and was a practicing physician. His system was rigorous but rigid, and did not extend beyond a narrow focus on physical health. Russell Trawl, 1812 to 1877, founded the first hygienic medical college and was a serious promoter of water therapy. Again, single focus, no global mission, no institutional longevity. James Caleb Jackson, 1811 to 1895, created the first cold breakfast cereal in 1863, the exact same year as White's health vision. He operated a health sanitarium in Dansville, New York, which White actually visited in 1864. What made White's approach uniquely durable? 5 things. She integrated spiritual and physical health, where the others focused only on physical. She was explicitly balanced, warning against dietary fanaticism. She was scientifically flexible, open to incorporating new knowledge. She created global institutions, with 170 plus hospitals still operating today. And she advocated progressive, gradual transition rather than immediate absolutes. That last quality alone explains why her approach outlasted all the others. Part 1. Summary. The prophecy was real. First, Ellen White warned of a coming food crisis in 1899, 44 years before the Green Revolution began, and 105 years before peer-reviewed science confirmed the collapse in food quality. The warning was specific, not a vague spiritual concern, but the assertion that rising disease in animals and the corruption of the earth would make the food supply unsafe to depend on, requiring wholesome substitutes. Second, USDA data, the government's own food composition database, confirms a 6 to 38% decline in 6 key nutrients across 43 crops between 1950 and 1999. This is not a fringe finding. It was published in the Journal of the American College of Nutrition and is consistent with independent UK food composition data. Third, the NIH-funded Adventist Health Study 2, with 96,000 participants, peer-reviewed in JAMA Internal Medicine, confirms that White's 1863 health principles, followed by real people in real communities, add 4 to 10 years of measurable life. Fourth, every mechanism that fulfilled the prophecy, chemical farming, yield-focused breeding, and soil depletion, emerged after her death in 1915. She could not have reverse-engineered her warnings from outcomes she did not live to see. Now that we know the food has been compromised, what exactly is it doing to your body? That is part 2, and the answer is more specific, more documented, and more personal than most of you will expect. Part 1. Expansion. The depleted food chain. Part 1 showed that Ellen White's prophecy was real and that nutrients have declined. Before we move to what that does inside your body, let's follow the depleted food all the way through the chain, because the story is bigger than crops alone. The same depleted crops feed both humans and animals, and disease is rising in both. That depleted feed travels through every animal industry and onto your plate. And here's the twist. Even people who eat plants directly fall short when the plants themselves are depleted. One principle ties it all together, and it's the one Ellen White pointed to. It isn't about plants versus meat. It's nutrient density at the source. 3 reasons your food is less nutritious today. If your food is less nourishing than it used to be, and it is, there isn't one villain. There are 3, and they're all working at once. The first is the soil itself. Conventional fertilizer is NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, 3 nutrients. But a head of wheat pulls out far more than 3, zinc, selenium, copper, and 14 others. We've been putting back 3 and removing 17, harvest after harvest, for about 70 years. You can see the result in livestock forage, where between 63 and 82% of U.S. forage tests zinc deficient. That's the USDA's own survey from 1999. The second is the seed. We bred plants to grow faster and yield more, and we got it. But the roots can't pull minerals out of the ground fast enough to keep up with all that new mass. So you get a bigger plant with less nutrition packed into each gram. In wheat, the hybrids that came in after 1965 carry at least 25% fewer minerals. That's FAN 2008. The third is everything that happens after harvest. Picking early, shipping long distances, processing. That degrades whatever vitamins survive the first 2 steps. Riboflavin in U.S. crops dropped 38% between 1950 and 1999. Davis, 2004. Here's the part to hold on to. These aren't alternatives, they stack. Every crop takes all 3 hits, one on top of the other. The proof: hybrid genetics dilutes nutrients, even on good soil. How do we know it's really the seed and not just tired soil? Because of one of the most beautiful long-term experiments in agriculture. At Broadbalk in England, they've kept archived wheat samples going back to 1845, 160 years of grain in jars. When you measure the minerals across that whole stretch, the wheat is rock steady from 1845 all the way to the mid-1960s. Then, right after 1965, when the new hybrid varieties came in, the minerals fall off a cliff. And here's the kicker. The soil minerals over that same period actually held steady or went up. So the soil can't be the culprit. The genetics are. That's Fan, 2008. You see the same fingerprint in American corn. Scott's team at the USDA looked at 45 corn varieties from the 1920s to 2001. Protein going down, starch going up, losing about 1/3% of protein every decade for 80 years. And in U.S. wheat, Garvin found the same thing across 14 varieties. Iron, zinc, and selenium bred right out of the grain in the chase for higher yield. 3 independent lines of evidence, 1 conclusion. We didn't lose this nutrition by accident in the dirt. We bred it out. 1 depleted harvest, 2 different tables. Picture one depleted harvest leaving the field. It splits 2 ways. Some goes to our table, the rest goes to the feed trough. Same soil, same hybrid seed, same depletion. It just ends up on 2 different plates. On our side, look at how many Americans come up short. 95% don't get enough vitamin D. 84% fall short on vitamin E. More than half, 52%, don't get enough magnesium. 45% are low on vitamin A. That's NHA-NES data, Ryder 2020. Now look at the trough. 73% of U.S. beef cattle are deficient in at least 1 mineral by the time they're examined at necropsy. 46% are short on selenium, 1/3 on copper. And remember that forage number, 63 to 82% of it zinc deficient. That's the California Animal Health Lab and the USDA. This is the whole point of the chapter. It's not 2 separate problems. It's one depleted foundation feeding both of us. Deficiency drives disease in both populations. It's one thing to be deficient. The real question is whether it actually drives disease. In both populations, it does. Start with the animals, because the data there is brutally direct. When something dies, you can examine it. In a set of nearly 1,500 necropsies between 2012 and 2021, 73% were deficient in at least 1 mineral at death. Among the animals that died of respiratory disease, 68% were short on copper or selenium, the very minerals the immune system runs on. And the feedlot death rate? It rose 2.5 times between 1992 and 2017. That's Buddha 2023. Now us. 95% of U.S. adults are short on vitamin D, 52% on magnesium, and 6 in 10 American adults are now living with a chronic disease. That's the CDC. We can't autopsy a population the way we can a herd, but the pattern lines up on both sides of the trough. Deficiency, then disease. What was written in 1905, confirmed by Science Today. This is where the timing gets uncomfortable, in a good way. 3 things Ellen White wrote over a century ago, set next to what the science says now. In 1905, she wrote, "Flesh was never the best food, but its use is now doubly objectionable, since disease in animals is so rapidly increasing." Doubly objectionable because of rising animal disease. Well, feedlot death rates have more than doubled since the early 90s, and 73% of beef cattle are mineral deficient at necropsy. The disease in animals is, in fact, rapidly increasing. Same page, she wrote that those who eat flesh are but eating grains and vegetables at second hand, for the animal receives from these things the nutrition that produces growth. That's the food chain described in 1905. And we've now traced exactly that chain: depleted soil to depleted crop to depleted animal to depleted beef. Beef selenium directly mirrors what the animal was fed, Hinsa benis. And in 1911, if people only knew the value of the products of the ground, more diligent efforts would be made to cultivate the soil. U.S. crop nutrients fell 6 to 38% between 1950 and 1999. And when you rebuild soil health, the nutrient density comes back. Davis Montgomery. Every one of those quotes is verified word for word in the White Estate Archive, and every science citation carries a PMID. I'm not asking you to take any of it on faith. I'm asking you to notice the convergence. The same problem in every animal industry. You might think this is a cattle problem. It isn't. It shows up in every animal industry, and for the same reason. There are two broad camps. The ruminants, beef, dairy, sheep, goats, live on pasture, hay, and silage. They're eating off the same depleted soil that depletes our vegetables. Then the monogastrics, poultry and pigs, eat grain, mostly the same hybrid corn and soy. And soy adds its own twist, a compound called phytate that actually blocks zinc and copper absorption. So even the minerals that are present don't all get in. Different animals, different feeding strategies. But when you ask which minerals come up short, it's the same 6 everywhere: selenium, copper, zinc, manganese, cobalt, iodine. Those are the trace minerals most commonly deficient in U.S. forages across every grazing species. And the grain that feeds poultry and swine grows in that same exhausted ground. One depleted foundation feeding every animal industry at once. Arthington, Scott. Confirmed in every industry, different names, same cause. And when you go industry by industry, the deficiency wears a different name in each one, but it's the same underlying cause. In dairy, those mineral shortfalls, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, selenium, copper, zinc, weaken the immune cells and push up the risk of mastitis. Krzyzewski, 2021. In sheep, 28% of apparently healthy ewes are selenium deficient, and copper deficiency produces swayback in their lambs. Hassan, 2025. In poultry, the zinc that's naturally in a corn-soy feed simply isn't enough for a broiler unless you supplement it. Chen, 2022. And in pigs, vitamin E and selenium deficiency causes something called mulberry heart disease, a healthy-looking pig that suddenly drops dead. Van Vliet documented that back in 1977. 4 industries, 4 different diagnoses on paper. Trace them back, and they all lead to the same depleted feed. What the animal eats becomes what you eat. If you want the single cleanest proof that the animal's diet becomes your diet, it's selenium. Beef is the #1 source of selenium in the American diet, and the selenium in beef is a direct readout of what the animal ate. Researchers fed cattle a low selenium diet for 82 days and then measured the tissues. Selenium fell 77% in the liver, 49% in the blood, and 31% in the muscle. And the muscle is the part you eat. That's Benis, 2015. So what does that mean on your plate? The selenium you get from a serving of beef ranges from about 40 to 100 micrograms, a 2.5-fold spread, depending entirely on where that animal was raised and what grew in that soil. And here's the detail I find striking. Giving the cow a selenium supplement didn't raise the levels in its tissue. Only the background diet and the soil did. Deficient feed makes deficient meat. There's no shortcut around the dirt. Grass-fed versus grain-fed. The feed writes the result. So if the feed writes the result, grass versus grain should show up in the meat. It does. Grass-fed and grass-finished beef runs higher in omega-3 fats, higher in conjugated linoleic acid, 0.49% versus 0.31, and that difference is statistically solid. It carries more vitamin A and E precursors and more of the animal's own antioxidants, like glutathione. Grain-fed cattle, finished in the feedlot on that depleted corn-soy base, run the opposite way. Lower omega-3, higher omega-6, less CLA. And that's over 99% of commercial U.S. beef. Daily, 2010. But here's where I need you to be a careful shopper, because the label game is real. Grass-finished is not the same as grass-fed. A grass-finished animal may eat grain for most of its life and then spend its last 60 to 120 days on grass. And the USDA's grass-fed standard? It was withdrawn in 2016. The claim is now producer declared, and nobody's independently auditing it. The only way to know is third-party certification, like the American Grass-Fed Association, where someone actually inspects the farm. The biology is honest. The marketing isn't always. Meat's real value and what depletion takes away. I don't want this to land as meat is bad, because that's not what the data says. Meat does something plants struggle to. It's the dominant, sometimes the only, bioavailable source of several nutrients, and it delivers them without the phytate that blocks mineral absorption in plant foods. Of the world's supply, meat provides 56% of the B12, 19% of the zinc, 18% of the selenium, 13% of the iron. And its amino acids are absorbed at a rate of 0.83 to 1.0, about as high as any food on Earth. Smith, 2022. But here's the trap depletion sets. People eat meat precisely for selenium, zinc, iron, and B12. And when the animal is itself mineral deficient, and 73% of beef cattle are deficient in at least one mineral at necropsy, the meat delivers less of the very nutrients you ate it to get. A deficient animal cannot produce replete meat. The shortage at the source just follows the food right onto your plate. This naturally raises the question the whole series has been circling. Should we just eat lower on the food chain and go vegetarian? And it turns out there's a study almost custom built to answer it. The Adventist Health Study 2 enrolled about 96,000 Seventh-day Adventists. This cause-specific mortality analysis followed 88,400 of them for nearly 1 million person-years of data. Why is it the perfect study for us? Because it tracks Seventh-day Adventists in North America, a community that has practiced plant-based health reform for generations, built on the very writings this series examines. It's about as close to a controlled natural experiment as real life allows. A large group eating low on the food chain followed for years, right alongside neighbors eating the conventional way. And it didn't lump everyone into veg versus not. It compared 5 distinct patterns: non-vegetarian, semi-vegetarian, pesco-vegetarian, lacto-ovo, and vegan. So when we look at the results on the next slide, we're looking at gradations, not a slogan. Mostly healthier, with one honest exception. Here's the honest answer, and I want to give you both halves of it because anything else would be cherry picking. The benefits are real, and they're large. Among these patterns, death from diabetes was 49% lower, a hazard ratio of 0.51. Death from heart disease, 27% lower. Death from any cause, 11% lower. Lower obesity, lower diabetes, lower blood pressure across the board. And the lacto-ovo vegetarians ran blood pressure 43% lower. If the story stopped there, it'd be a clean win. But it doesn't stop there, and I won't pretend it does. In the oldest vegetarians, around age 85, a few numbers tip the other way. Parkinson's mortality, 37% higher. Stroke, 17% higher. Dementia, 13% higher. All neurological. Now, two caveats matter. That Parkinson's figure has a confidence interval that crosses 1.0, so it's not statistically significant, and the whole cluster reads like a B12 and omega-3 deficiency signal, not evidence that plants are harmful. It's the same lesson as the rest of this chapter. It's not the diet category, it's the missing nutrients. And a deficiency you can see is a deficiency you can fix. Abris, 2024. Expansion recap. Back to part 2. Let's bring the whole journey into one line. Depleted soil and diluted hybrid seed produce depleted crops. Those crops feed both humans and animals, leaving both deficient, and disease rises in both. And even people who eat plants directly fall short when the plants themselves are depleted. So here's the diagnosis. It was never plants versus meat. It's nutrient density at the source that determines health. The confirmation? Ellen White described this exact trajectory and its solution a full century before the science could verify it. And the solution she pointed to is the one the evidence now supports. Return to nutrient-dense food from well-cultivated soil, the natural products of the earth. Now, with that bigger picture in place, Part 2 takes us inside the body to show exactly what this nutrient decline does to your metabolism. Part 1 recap. Bridge to Part 2. Let me pull Part 1 back together in 4 clear points. First, the prophecy was specific. Ellen White warned in 1902 that the time would soon come when eggs, milk, cream, and butter would no longer be safe because disease in animals was increasing and the earth was being corrupted by human practices. The Green Revolution began 41 years later in 1943. Peer-reviewed science confirmed a 6 to 38% nutrient decline in crops 102 years later in 2004. The specificity of the warning and the accuracy of how it played out is the foundation of everything that follows. Second, the confirmation isn't anecdotal. It comes from the USDA's own food composition database, analyzed by Davis, Epp, and Riordan in the Journal of the American College of Nutrition. The government's own data confirms the prophecy. Third, White's 8 natural remedies, pure food, water, sunlight, exercise, rest, fresh air, temperance, and trust in God, are each now validated by modern peer-reviewed research. The NIH-funded Adventist Health Study 2, following 96,000 people, confirmed that those who practice these principles live 4 to 10 years longer, with measurably lower rates of the diseases that kill most Americans. Fourth, every mechanism that fulfilled the prophecy, chemical farming, yield-focused breeding, topsoil loss, emerged after her death in 1915. She could not have reverse-engineered her warnings. Then, the bridge into Part 2. The prophecy has been established. We know the food has been compromised, documented in government data and peer-reviewed literature. But that raises the next question, the one Part 2 answers. What exactly is this nutrient decline doing inside your body right now, at the cellular and molecular level? How does a 38% decline in vitamin B2 actually affect how you feel? How does a 20% decline in vitamin C actually change your immune function? What happens inside your DNA when folate is depleted? Part 2 takes us inside the body, and the answer is more specific, more documented, and I believe more personal than most of you will expect. Many of you may have been told your blood tests are normal while you still feel chronically tired, foggy, or unwell. Part 2 explains exactly why that happens. It has a name: subclinical malnutrition. It affects an estimated 2 billion people worldwide, many of them in wealthy countries eating more than enough calories every day. Let me pull part 1 back together in 4 clear points. First, the prophecy was specific. Ellen White warned in 1899 that disease was accumulating rapidly and the earth was being corrupted by human practices, so that some other food than animal food would have to be substituted for the human family. The Green Revolution began 44 years later, in 1943. Peer-reviewed science confirmed a 6 to 38% nutrient decline in crops 105 years later, in 2004. The specificity of the warning and the accuracy of how it played out is the foundation of everything that follows. Second, the confirmation isn't anecdotal. It comes from the USDA's own food composition database, analyzed by Davis, Epp, and Riordan in the Journal of the American College of Nutrition. The government's own data confirms the prophecy. Third, White's 8 natural remedies, pure food, water, sunlight, exercise, rest, fresh air, temperance, and trust in God, are each now validated by modern peer-reviewed research. The NIH-funded Adventist Health Study 2, following 96,000 people, confirmed that those who practice these principles live 4 to 10 years longer, with measurably lower rates of the diseases that kill most Americans. Fourth, every mechanism that fulfilled the prophecy, chemical farming, yield-focused breeding, topsoil loss, emerged after her death in 1915. She could not have reverse-engineered her warnings. Then, the bridge into part 2. The prophecy has been established. We know the food has been compromised, documented in government data and peer-reviewed literature. But that raises the next question, the one part 2 answers. What exactly is this nutrient decline doing inside your body right now, at the cellular and molecular level? How does a 38% decline in vitamin B2 actually affect how you feel? How does a 20% decline in vitamin C actually change your immune function? What happens inside your DNA when folate is depleted? Part 2 takes us inside the body, and the answer is more specific, more documented, and I believe more personal than most of you will expect. Many of you may have been told your blood tests are normal, while you still feel chronically tired, foggy, or unwell. Part 2 explains exactly why that happens. It has a name: subclinical malnutrition. It affects an estimated 2 billion people worldwide, many of them in wealthy countries eating more than enough calories every day.